The wedding convoy of billionaire chief executive Blythe Calloway was 3 miles from the church when a battered pickup truck slammed across the avenue and blocked every lane at once. 10 armed bodyguards swarmed the man who stepped out, but Gavin Mercer did not run and did not flinch. He stared straight through the bulletproof glass into the eyes of the bride and raised a cracked, long-dead phone into the air. Blythe went pale at the engraving on its back, a phone belonging to the father she believed had died in a crash 12 years earlier. Then Gavin spoke 6 words that ended the wedding before it began. The man in that accident never actually died. If a 12-year-old secret could unravel a wedding this large, the only question left was who Gavin Mercer was truly trying to protect and why he had waited until the exact hour vows were about to be spoken. The morning had begun like something out of a magazine. Spread the kind of morning that made strangers stop and stare even from a distance. Blythe Calloway sat in the back of an armored sport utility vehicle, her wedding gown pressed flawlessly against the leather seat, while a line of matching black vehicles trailed behind her through the city. Reporters had been calling it the corporate wedding of the year for weeks. Camera crews stationed along the entire route toward the old stone church downtown. Preston Vale, her fiancé, was already waiting at the altar, charming and composed as always, the man credited with rescuing Calloway Meridian Group from a financial crisis years before. Security had been tightened beyond anything Blythe had experienced before, ever since a string of anonymous threats arrived in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. Grant Hollowell, the head of corporate security, had given a single, unbending order to every driver in the convoy that morning. Under no circumstance was any vehicle to stop. At an intersection less than 3 miles from the church, that order became impossible to follow. Brakes shrieked across wet asphalt as the lead vehicles slammed to a halt, and within seconds the security detail poured out with weapons raised toward the driver of the pickup truck, now blocking their path. Gavin Mercer carried no weapon, made no attempt to flee, and simply stood there with his hands loosely at his sides, while Grant screamed at him to get on the ground. Instead, Gavin asked for 30 seconds to speak with Blythe Calloway directly, a request Grant refused without hesitation. 2 agents seized Gavin by the arms and began dragging him away from the vehicles, and it was in that exact moment that he pulled the scorched, outdated phone from his jacket pocket and held it high enough for the cameras and the bride alike to see. Through the tinted glass of her vehicle, Blythe caught sight of 3 hand-carved letters etched into the back casing. The letters she recognized instantly because they belonged to her father. Edward Charles Calloway had died 12 years ago, according to every official record, every obituary, and every memory Blythe carried since she was 24 years old. She ordered her driver to stop the vehicle, ignoring Grant's frantic warning that this could easily be a trap designed to draw her into the open. Stepping out into the cold morning air in her wedding gown, she watched as Gavin carefully placed the old phone on the hood of the vehicle, rather than throwing it or forcing it into her hands. A small triangular scratch near the corner of the casing caught her eye immediately. A scratch she herself had made by accident during her college years when she dropped the phone on a marble floor. There was no possibility this was a forgery. No way anyone could have replicated a mark that specific unless they had actually held the original object. When she asked Gavin where he had gotten it, his answer landed like a blow to the chest. He had recovered it from inside the very car that police reports claimed had burned completely in the crash that killed her father. He continued before she could respond, telling her plainly that the man riding inside that vehicle on the day of the crash had not been her father at all. Blythe stood frozen on the pavement in her wedding dress as the weight of that sentence settled over her, the noise of the surrounding city fading into a dull hum. Gavin reached into his jacket once more and produced a single photograph worn soft at the corners from years of handling, and placed it gently into her hands. In the photograph stood a man who looked unmistakably like her father, older than she remembered him, standing outside a modest apartment building she did not recognize. Written faintly on the back in pencil was a date that made her stomach drop the moment she read it, because it fell 3 full days after her father had officially been declared dead. Blythe's first instinct was suspicion, a reflex sharpened by years of running a company that attracted schemers and opportunists at every turn. She assumed Gavin was manipulating her, perhaps working with someone who wanted to disrupt the wedding for financial gain, and she ordered Grant to examine the photograph for signs of digital tampering. The paper itself was old enough that any metadata had long since disappeared. printed on stock that had gone out of production more than a decade earlier. One detail, however, made denial impossible, no matter how badly she wanted to dismiss it. In the photograph, the man was wearing the Calloway family watch, an heirloom passed down through 3 generations, the very same watch that investigators had never recovered from the wreckage of the crash. Gavin explained that 12 years earlier he had worked as a young technician for a firm that specialized in reconstructing vehicle data after serious accidents. He had been assigned to extract information from the electronic control module of the sedan, believed to belong to Edward Calloway, a routine job that should have ended with a routine report. Instead, the data told a story that contradicted everything the official investigation had concluded about that night. The braking system had not failed due to mechanical wear or driver error, as the public record claimed, but had been deliberately disabled through the vehicle's electronic systems. More disturbing still, the weight sensor embedded in the driver's seat recorded a body nearly 40 pounds lighter than Edward Calloway's known weight at the time of his death. Gavin filed a report flagging these anomalies, immediately certain his superiors would want to investigate further, given the implications. Instead, by the following morning, every file related to the case had vanished from the company servers without explanation. He was summoned into a private office and pressured into signing a strict confidentiality agreement, told simply that the matter was closed and not to be discussed again. 2 days later, the firm issued an internal notice claiming the recovered data had been corrupted beyond recovery, a claim Gavin knew to be false because he still held a personal backup copy. He never told anyone what he had, not for years, because everyone who tried to push the truth further seemed to disappear from the story entirely. An investigator who had asked too many questions abruptly resigned from the case and moved out of state without warning. A fellow technician who mentioned the discrepancies to a supervisor relocated across the country within weeks and eventually stopped answering calls altogether. A young attorney who briefly represented the Calloway estate withdrew from the matter overnight, citing reasons she refused to explain even to close colleagues. Gavin chose silence after watching these patterns repeat themselves, convinced that staying quiet was the only way to stay safe. That silence held for 12 years until 3 weeks before Blythe's wedding, when an unmarked envelope arrived at his home with no return address. Inside was the scorched phone he now stood holding on a public street, along with a single handwritten line warning him to stop her before Vale gained control of the company. Blythe turned instinctively toward the direction of the church, toward the man she had trusted enough to marry within the hour. Preston Vale, polished and celebrated throughout the financial world, suddenly felt like a stranger standing at the end of an aisle she was no longer certain she should walk down. Before she could fully process the thought, the old phone in her hands began to vibrate violently despite having no active service and no inserted memory card. A single message appeared glowing on the cracked screen, stark and impossible to ignore, warning her not to go to the church under any circumstance. Grant immediately called for an emergency evacuation, insisting they move Blythe to a secure location before anyone else arrived on scene. Gavin, however, examined the phone more closely and realized the message had not traveled through any cellular network at all. Someone had modified the device to receive short-range radio signals, instead a method that only worked within a very limited physical distance. That single detail meant whoever had sent the warning was close enough to see them standing there in the middle of the street. Grant ordered his team to scan the surrounding buildings for any sign of surveillance, while Blythe tried desperately to reach Preston by phone, receiving only silence in return. When she called Mallory Vance, her general counsel, instead, Mallory explained that confusion was spreading at the church because the convoy had never arrived, and no one could explain the delay. In the middle of the chaos, Gavin asked Blythe an unusual question that seemed to catch her completely off guard. He wanted to know whether marrying Preston that day would grant him any form of control over Calloway Meridian Group. Blythe hesitated before admitting that a shareholder agreement had quietly been revised 4 months earlier, buried among hundreds of pages of routine corporate paperwork. The clause stated that, if Blythe ever lost the capacity to lead the company, or passed away after marriage, voting authority over her family's controlling shares would transfer temporarily to her spouse. The person who had proposed that specific clause was Dorian Kessler, the longtime chairman of the board, and a man Blythe had trusted since childhood. The legal team that finalized the language had been recommended personally by Preston himself. The scale of the danger she now stood inside began to take shape in Blythe's mind, piece by piece, like a structure she had never noticed being built around her. Grant urged her to return immediately to company headquarters where security was strongest, but Gavin pushed back hard against the idea. If the people behind this had already infiltrated her closest circle, he argued, headquarters might be more dangerous than the open street they stood on now. Grant bristled at the implication that his own team could be compromised, insisting his agents had all been personally vetted. It was at that exact moment that Gavin noticed one of the trailing security vehicles flashing its brake lights in an unusual, deliberate rhythm. 3 short flashes followed by 2 long ones, then 3 short again, repeating in a pattern he recognized instantly from old surveillance documentation buried in the same file he had once been ordered to destroy. He shouted for everyone to abandon the vehicle immediately, seconds before its engine compartment erupted in a controlled explosion. The blast was not powerful enough to kill anyone standing nearby, but it was more than enough to lock the entire convoy in place at the intersection. This had never been an assassination attempt in the traditional sense. It was a method of forcing them to stand still. From several blocks away, a plain white van began rolling steadily toward the scene, moving with a patience that felt far more threatening than any high-speed pursuit. Gavin squinted at its license plate as it drew closer, and the color drained from his face when the registration numbers finally came into focus. It carried the exact same falsified registration code that had appeared buried within the accident files from Edward Calloway's crash 12 years earlier. A code he had memorized without ever meaning to. Realizing they were being deliberately surrounded rather than simply attacked, Gavin pulled Blythe toward the lead vehicle still capable of driving. Grant objected loudly, but Blythe overruled him without hesitation, ordering everyone to follow Gavin's lead for now. The white van accelerated the moment they moved, and 2 additional vehicles emerged from side streets to close off their remaining escape routes. Notably, absent was any indiscriminate gunfire, which told Gavin everything he needed to know about the true objective. Whoever orchestrated this wanted Blythe alive, not dead, at least not yet, and the reason became obvious the instant he thought it through. If Blythe died before the wedding ceremony was completed, the shareholder clause transferring control to her spouse would never activate in the first place. But if she married Preston first, even under duress, he would legally become the temporary controlling authority over Callaway Meridian Group the moment vows were exchanged. After that, arranging a convenient accident for the new widow would be a simple matter of timing and patience. Gavin steered the vehicle through a series of technical shortcuts he remembered from years spent inspecting commercial fleets across the city, weaving through a multi-level parking structure and an old service tunnel most drivers didn't even know existed. The chase carried them straight through the heart of downtown, before finally breaking free of their pursuers entirely. Blythe found herself watching Gavin with new eyes, no longer seeing simply a stranger who had blocked her convoy that morning. He did not carry himself like an ordinary electronics technician, and she said as much once they had a moment to breathe. Gavin explained quietly that years spent studying reconstructed accidents had taught him how vehicles behaved under pressure, how roadblocks were designed, and how to recognize a staged collision from a genuine one at a single glance. Grant, still shaken from losing his own security vehicle, reviewed the internal communication logs and made a discovery that unsettled everyone in the car. No one outside their immediate circle had known the convoy's final route change that morning, which meant the leak had to come from somewhere inside. Only 6 people had access to that information: Blythe, Preston, Grant himself, Mallory Dorian, and the security coordinator who managed the day's logistics. One of those 6 had handed their location to the people chasing them. Gavin suggested checking Blythe's personal phone for anything unusual, and within minutes he found an application disguised as a simple scheduling tool, quietly transmitting her location in real time. The application had been installed only 2 weeks earlier, and the link used to install it had been sent directly from Preston's own device. Before anyone could fully process the implication, Blythe's phone rang with an incoming call from the very man they were now certain had betrayed her. Blythe put the call on speaker, her hands trembling slightly despite her effort to stay composed. Preston's voice came through calm and level, almost gentle, as if nothing at all had gone wrong that morning. He asked without preamble whether she was currently with a man named Gavin Mercer, a name that no one had spoken to him at any point that day. The silence that followed stretched long enough for everyone in the vehicle to understand exactly how much danger they were truly in. Preston pressed forward before Blythe could respond. warning her that Gavin was a disturbed individual who had once tried to extort money from the Calloway family years earlier. Gavin denied the accusation immediately, but Preston continued speaking with unsettling precision, reciting Gavin's employment history, his former addresses, and details of his personal finances that no stranger should have known. Most alarming of all, Preston named the exact reconstruction project Gavin had worked on 12 years earlier, a project that had never once been made public in any form. Gavin asked how he possibly could have known that unless he had personally purchased the firm where Gavin once worked. Preston said nothing at all, and the silence answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Gavin remembered now that his old employer had quietly changed ownership only 6 months after Edward Calloway's crash, buried under layers of shell corporations designed to obscure the trail. Tracing that ownership backward eventually led to Vale Capital, the very firm Preston had built his early career on before entering high society. Blythe demanded an explanation, but Preston simply ended the call without another word. Gavin told the group they now needed something more valuable than the old phone currently sitting between them, the backup copy of the original accident data he had secretly preserved 12 years earlier. It remained sealed inside a deposit box at an old bank branch on the southern edge of the city, untouched since the day he placed it there. They arrived at the bank only to discover the box had already been opened, its contents removed entirely. A teller explained that someone had presented valid authorization paperwork bearing Gavin's own signature just days earlier, though Gavin insisted he had never signed anything of the kind. Security footage was pulled immediately, revealing that the person who emptied the box had visited exactly 6 days before the wedding. It was not Preston standing in that footage, and it was not Dorian either. Blythe recognized the face the instant it appeared clearly on screen, and her stomach turned. It belonged to Mallory Vance, her own general counsel, and one of the very few people at the company she had trusted without reservation. Almost immediately, Mallory called Blythe's phone directly, her voice tight with urgency rather than guilt. She told Blythe not to trust Gavin, insisting she had taken the files only because a man claiming to be Edward Calloway himself had instructed her to secure them before Preston could reach them first. Blythe demanded proof of something so impossible, and Mallory sent through a short audio recording within minutes. An older man's voice played through the speaker, calm and deliberate, instructing that if Gavin Mercer ever appeared on the wedding day, the files needed to be secured before Preston could intercept them. Blythe recognized her father's voice, instantly unmistakable, even after 12 years of silence, and the recognition hit her harder than anything else that morning. It was not simply the tone or cadence that convinced her, but a single private phrase buried within the recording that only she and her father had ever shared. Mallory finally revealed the secret she had carried alone for 2 years. She explained that she had first been contacted by someone claiming to be Edward roughly 2 years earlier, though the two of them had never once met face to face. All communication arrived through heavily encrypted channels, careful instructions delivered with no room for negotiation or explanation. Edward had told her he needed to disappear after uncovering a hidden network quietly siphoning money out of Calloway Meridian Group from the inside. The crash, 12 years ago, according to this account, had never actually been intended to kill him at all. He had staged his own death deliberately, hoping it would convince the people behind the scheme that he was no longer a threat worth pursuing. The plan, however, had failed in the worst possible way. An innocent man had died inside that vehicle instead of the empty shell Edward had originally arranged. Edward had carried the guilt of that death silently for 12 years, unable to come forward without confessing his own role in the deception. Blythe's anger boiled over the moment she understood the full picture, furious that her father had allowed her to grieve him for over a decade, simply to protect himself. Gavin, still trying to piece together the sequence of events, asked the obvious question hanging over the entire conversation. If Edward truly controlled events from the shadows, why choose this exact wedding day to intervene after so many years of silence? Mallory explained that Preston had just finalized the last stage of a financial transaction worth several $billion. Once married, he would gain the legal authority to sign off on transferring an enormous portion of company assets outside Calloway Meridian entirely. Blythe asked who truly stood behind Preston in all of this, and Mallory hesitated before answering. She sent through a scanned document containing a signature Blythe recognized immediately from years of board meetings and shared decisions. It belonged to Dorian Kessler, the man she had called uncle since she was a teenager, the closest thing to family she had left outside her own father. Gavin studied the document closely and then pointed silently to the date printed at the bottom of the page. It had been signed 2 full weeks before Edward Calloway's crash ever occurred, long before anyone believed a conspiracy of this scale had even begun to take shape. Mallory arranged a private meeting with Blythe, Gavin, and Grant inside an old Calloway Meridian storage warehouse near the industrial district, far from prying eyes. She brought with her the data she had taken from the deposit box, along with everything else she had quietly gathered over the past 2 years. Gavin worked carefully to restore the files, piecing together fragments that had been deliberately corrupted years earlier by someone with technical skill. What emerged was a portrait of an accident, planned with frightening precision from the very beginning. The braking system had been disabled remotely well in advance. Traffic surveillance cameras along the route had gone dark for exactly the window needed. A replacement vehicle had been quietly substituted into the route at the last possible moment, and the official identification of the body inside had been altered afterward to complete the deception. Every step required someone with real power both inside the company and beyond it, someone capable of manipulating systems most people never even knew existed. Blythe initially assumed Dorian had simply orchestrated her father's murder, outright a betrayal cold enough to explain everything that followed. Gavin, however, found a short audio fragment buried within the recovered files that complicated the story considerably. Recorded just before the vehicle departed on its final route, 2 distinct voices could be heard speaking in low, urgent tones. One belonged to Dorian Kessler. The other belonged unmistakably to Edward Calloway himself. Blythe sat in stunned silence as the recording played through a second time. The 2 men were not enemies plotting against one another in that moment, but partners coordinating the very deception that would define the next 12 years of her life. Edward had chosen to fake his own death willingly, and Dorian had helped him carry it out from the very beginning. The obvious question became impossible to avoid. If the 2 men had once worked together this closely, what had turned Dorian into the enemy standing before them now? Mallory pulled up another document to answer it, laying it flat across the table between them. After Edward vanished from public life, Dorian had slowly consolidated power across the company, almost unnoticed year after year, decision after decision. He began quietly repurposing the same shell corporations originally built to protect Edward's hidden assets during the deception. When Preston entered the picture years later, the 2 men transformed that fragile network into a sprawling system designed to drain money out of Calloway Meridian undetected. Edward eventually discovered what had happened to his own creation, but by then he could do nothing to stop it without exposing himself entirely. Coming forward publicly would mean confessing that he had staged his death, and in doing so caused an innocent man's death in the process. Dorian understood this leverage completely, and it was precisely why he no longer feared Edward at all. Blythe finally understood the shape of the trap her father had built without ever meaning to. He had created a monster during a moment of desperation, and then spent 12 years watching helplessly as that monster slipped entirely out of his control. Gavin opened one final file, buried deep within the recovered archive, a long ledger tracking payments stretching back over more than a decade. Preston's name appeared repeatedly throughout the records, as did Dorian's, exactly as expected given everything they now knew. But a third name appeared as well, one that made the room fall completely silent the moment Gavin read it aloud. It belonged to Grant Hollowell, the very man standing beside them, the one who had been guarding Blythe's life since sunrise that morning. Grant moved quickly to the warehouse door and locked it from the inside before anyone could react. He turned slowly, pulling a small radio from his belt, rather than a weapon, his expression unreadable in the dim overhead light. He said only that it was fortunate everyone happened to be gathered in the same place at once. Blythe confronted him directly, refusing to let fear silence her in that moment. Grant admitted without much resistance that he had accepted money from Dorian for several years, a confession that landed heavily in the quiet warehouse. He insisted, however, that his involvement was never as simple as it appeared from the outside. He claimed he had spent recent weeks actively working to keep Blythe alive despite the instructions he had been given. Dorian wanted her delivered safely to the church that morning, while Preston needed the ceremony to be completed at any cost. Once the marriage was finalized, Grant explained a second staged accident had already been arranged to remove Blythe permanently from the picture. Grant said he had gone along with the surveillance and the planning for as long as he could stomach it, but he refused to become complicit in an actual killing. That refusal was why he had detonated the earlier vehicle himself, sacrificing his own security team's equipment in order to disrupt the timeline before it could fully unfold. Gavin pointed out that Grant clearly wasn't the source feeding their real-time location to the pursuers earlier that morning, since he had been with them the entire time. Someone else, still unaccounted for, remained out there working against them. Grant confirmed that Dorian had shifted strategies entirely once the convoy disappeared from the planned route. Preston was no longer heading toward the church at all. He was instead racing toward Callaway Meridian's headquarters, intent on triggering an emergency board resolution before Blythe could intervene. If she were declared missing or unable to safely perform her duties during an active crisis, the board held the authority to grant temporary executive control to a designated successor. Dorian had already prepared the necessary votes in advance, confident the outcome would go entirely his way. The name written on that designation was Preston Vale. Blythe made her decision instantly, insisting they reach headquarters before the vote could be finalized. Gavin warned her that walking straight into the building was likely exactly what their enemies wanted her to do. She answered simply that this time they would arrive in a way no one had prepared for. Gavin devised a plan using ordinary company service vehicles instead of the recognizable convoy, splitting the group to avoid drawing attention. Mallory carried the physical evidence with her. Grant transmitted everything he had gathered internally to federal investigators before anyone could stop him. Gavin and Blythe made their way through an old maintenance tunnel system beneath the headquarters tower, a route few employees even knew still existed. Walking through the dim underground corridor, Blythe finally asked Gavin the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since that morning. She wanted to know what had truly driven him to return to this fight after 12 years of silence. Gavin admitted a part of the truth he had kept hidden, until now his voice steady despite the weight of it. The man who died inside that vehicle in place of Edward Callaway had not been a stranger at all. He had been Gavin's own older brother, Nolan Mercer, a delivery driver, hired that day simply to return the vehicle to a repair garage across town. Gavin had spent 12 years trying to prove that Nolan's death was never the random accident everyone had accepted it to be. This was never only about protecting Blythe from danger. It was a debt he had been carrying far longer than she had even known to grieve her father. When they finally reached the executive floor, the large screen mounted above the boardroom table already displayed the outcome everyone had feared. Preston Vale had been approved as interim executive authority, the vote already counted and finalized before they had even arrived. The boardroom doors swung open, and Blythe walked through them, still wearing her wedding gown, the fabric trailing slightly against the polished floor. The entire room fell silent the instant she appeared, board members frozen mid-conversation. Dorian struggled to maintain his composure at the head of the table. Preston stood near the chairman's seat, already positioning himself as though the transition of power had already been settled. He announced quickly that Blythe appeared to be under the influence of a disturbed stranger and was not currently fit to make decisions on behalf of the company. Blythe refused to engage with emotional arguments and instead turned directly to Mallory, asking her to display everything they had gathered. The transfers appeared first across the screen, followed by the shell corporations, then the reconstructed accident files, and finally Dorian's signature dated weeks before the crash. Dorian countered immediately, insisting that every piece of evidence originated from a fraud Edward Callaway himself had orchestrated from the very beginning. If any of it reached a courtroom, he argued Edward would be dragged down alongside everyone else in the room. Blythe answered without hesitation, telling the board that her father could simply answer for himself. The room went completely still as a video call connected on the main screen. An older man with graying hair appeared, his face weathered but unmistakably familiar. Edward Callaway looked directly into the camera, and Blythe saw her father clearly for the first time in 12 years. Edward admitted openly that he had faked his own death, acknowledging the devastating consequences of that decision without hesitation or excuse. He confirmed that Dorian had helped him carry out the deception at the very start, exactly as the recording had shown. But he also confirmed something far more damning, that Dorian and Preston together had since turned his original protective network into an active scheme of embezzlement. Preston's composure finally cracked completely, and he attempted to bolt for the nearest exit before security could react. Gavin stepped directly into his path, blocking the doorway without raising a hand in aggression. A brief, tense struggle broke out as Preston tried to snatch the hard drive containing the evidence, but Gavin held firm and refused to let go. Grant arrived moments later alongside investigators who had already been alerted and briefed beforehand. Dorian, cornered, but not yet finished, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He argued that digital evidence alone could easily be challenged in court, and that no one in the room possessed physical proof directly tying him to events from over a decade earlier. Gavin calmly placed the scorched, battered phone onto the polished table in front of everyone present. He opened the back casing, carefully revealing a tiny memory card hidden beneath the battery compartment that no one else had known existed. Dorian's face drained of all remaining color the moment he saw it. Gavin told the room plainly that this was the piece of evidence he had intended to show Blythe from the very beginning, long before any of this reached the boardroom. The recording began to play across the massive screen for everyone present to witness. Edward had secretly captured the final conversation between himself and Dorian, recorded moments before the staged crash was set into motion 12 years earlier. In the beginning of the recording, both men appeared to be in full agreement about faking Edward's death together. But partway through, Dorian said a single sentence that Edward had not understood the true meaning of until many years later. He told Edward not to worry about the driver, assuring him that detail had already been handled. That sentence alone proved Dorian had known in advance that Nolan Mercer would be inside the vehicle that night. Edward's original plan had called for an empty car, one he intended to burn only after he had safely disappeared from public life. Dorian had quietly altered that plan without Edward's knowledge or consent. He understood that a convincing death required an actual body, not simply an abandoned vehicle. Nolan Mercer paid the price for that decision without ever knowing what he had walked into. Gavin finally had the full truth laid bare in front of him after 12 long years of searching. Dorian was arrested on the spot, facing a long list of charges, including large-scale fraud conspiracy and the deliberate concealment of evidence tied to a death that had never been properly investigated. Preston was taken into custody as well, charged for his role in the financial network and his direct involvement in the plot to seize control of Callaway Meridian through marriage. Grant cooperated fully with investigators moving forward, accepting responsibility for the choices he had made, even as he insisted on the ways he had tried to limit the damage from within. Edward agreed to return publicly and surrender himself to authorities, accepting whatever consequences awaited him for staging his own death so many years ago. Blythe did not forgive her father immediately, and she made no effort to pretend otherwise in front of anyone. She told him plainly that he had not saved her by allowing her to spend 12 years trapped inside a lie of his own making. Edward accepted the weight of that statement without argument, offering no excuses in return. Callaway Meridian entered a period of significant internal restructuring in the weeks that followed, shedding years of hidden corruption layer by layer. Blythe personally dissolved every clause tied to marriage and executive succession that Dorian had quietly buried within company bylaws. The wedding, of course, never took place at all. Several weeks later, Gavin received a formal invitation to visit the chief executive's office at Callaway Meridian headquarters. Blythe offered him leadership of a newly created, fully independent division focused on internal fraud detection and system security. Gavin hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the idea of accepting a prestigious title or a corner office after so many years spent working quietly on his own terms. Blythe told him she wasn't looking for someone loyal to the company, simply for the sake of loyalty. Gavin looked at her carefully, waiting for her to finish the thought. She said what she truly needed was someone willing to stand in front of her vehicle again if she ever started heading in the wrong direction. Gavin allowed himself a small, genuine smile at that, and he accepted the position on a single non-negotiable condition. No one within the company would ever again be permitted to erase a technical report simply because the truth it contained proved inconvenient. Blythe agreed without a moment's hesitation. The final image of that long, chaotic day belonged to the old scorched phone itself, now sealed carefully inside a labeled evidence box. Its screen no longer lit up, its battery long dead, its casing still bearing the same triangular scratch that had convinced Blythe of its authenticity that morning. Yet what had been hidden inside that lifeless device had managed to stop a wedding, expose a 12-year conspiracy, and finally return a name and a story to Nolan Mercer, a man the world had forgotten. Gavin walked out of the headquarters building that evening, without fanfare, disappearing into the ordinary flow of the city around him. Blythe stood near the glass wall of her office and watched him go, saying nothing. In the months that followed, the story of that morning slowly settled into something closer to legend inside the company's walls, told and retold by employees who had only heard fragments of what actually happened. Federal investigators spent nearly a year unraveling the full scope of the network Dorian and Preston had built together, tracing money through dozens of shell corporations scattered across several states. Grant testified extensively during that process. And while his cooperation did not erase what he had done, it did soften the sentence he eventually received. Edward Calloway pleaded guilty to a narrow set of charges tied directly to staging his own death, accepting a lengthy period of supervised release rather than years behind bars, a resolution that satisfied almost no one completely. Blythe visited him twice during that first year, brief and formal conversations that carried none of the warmth either of them might have once shared. She was not yet ready to call him father again, and she made no promises about when or whether that might change. Mallory was formally promoted to general counsel with expanded authority over compliance, a role she approached now with a wariness that had not existed in her before that wedding day. She kept a framed photograph of Nolan Mercer on her desk, a quiet reminder of the cost paid by a man who had simply been doing his job the night everything went wrong. Gavin spent his first months leading the new fraud division, rebuilding systems from the ground up, refusing to trust any inherited process without personally verifying it first. He hired slowly and carefully, choosing people who reminded him of who he used to be 12 years earlier before silence had felt like the only safe option available to him. Blythe found herself stopping by his office more often than her schedule, strictly required, telling herself each time that it was simply a matter of oversight. There was no rushed declaration of romance in that quiet moment, no dramatic promise exchanged between them. There was only a deep, hard-earned respect between two people who had just survived a truth far larger than either of them had expected to face that morning. And standing there in the fading evening light, Blythe finally understood the strange, almost unbelievable truth about the man who had blocked her wedding convoy that day. He had never been trying to destroy her future at all. He had been trying to stop her from walking willingly and unaware straight into a trap that had been waiting patiently for her for 12 long years.